I do want to dig into the history of zoning, though. We spoke a little bit about in the very beginning how these things started to erupt. I want to get into the more racial aspects of it, probably inching after World War II, right? Is World War II where a lot of this stuff started changing? The flight to the
Yeah.
suburbs?
So yeah, a lot of the zoning rules start to come online immediately after World War One, but to your question, they don't really start to have an effect until after World War Two, because part of what happens, right? So over the course of the 20s, where it's the slow move toward mass car ownership and the steady adoption of a lot of these rules. Then with the 30s, there's basically no building. So it doesn't actually matter what the rules are because nothing's really getting built. But then in the aftermath of World War II, of course, we undertake this huge building boom, and it's all subject to this new planning paradigm. So your question about race, part of where these rules come from is over the course of the early 20th century, there's the great migration of African Americans out of the South. And so they're moving into cities in the upper South, and especially in places like my home state of Kentucky, but also certain northern cities. And so what cities start trying to do is they try to adopt explicitly racial zoning. So this is like South Africa style zoning where they say, okay, whites can live here, blacks can live here, right? I mean, really crazy stuff. In 1917, the Supreme Court and the decision Buchanan v. Worley says, okay, explicitly racial zoning is not constitutional, not acceptable. So they wipe that out. But then in the aftermath of that, what cities start doing is they start looking for other mechanisms for controlling who can live where. And what cities arrive at is modern zoning codes, which don't ever mention race, but they say, well, if you can't afford a home of a certain quality, you're not allowed to live in this neighborhood. And so it achieves this segregated outcome, both on the basis of race and class, right? If you are a lower middle income American, you're simply not allowed to live in more affluent neighborhoods because the housing that would be affordable to you is illegal to build. And
Mm-hmm.
so, of course, there's a big racial component to that. And that's important, right? Because something we've seen, especially over the last 70 years, is there's actually been a lot of progress on racial desegregation in our cities, but our cities are actually getting more segregated on the basis of income, right? So this classic American neighborhood where you might have the wealthy doctor and the lawyer, you might have the working class kid. You have this mixture of incomes, and you have this mixture of a community that stretches across maybe hard class boundaries, which I think is why Americans for so long thought of themselves as sort of post-class, in the way that was much more relevant in Europe. As we've actually started to institutionalize all these zoning policies, our cities get a lot more segregated on the basis of income. And you see this divergence, I think, of the American population. So, and again, people always, I think when you talk about this stuff, people are like, oh yeah, that's a bad thing we did 100 years ago. That's a bad thing we did 50 years ago. You got to shake people and be like, these rules are on the books in your city today, right? This is still the official law in most U.S. cities. And until we understand it, we're not going to be able to fix it.
The exact same thing played out in my neighborhood I just moved into. I just spoke with a lady the other day about this exact same thing. She's lived in the neighborhood a lot longer than I have. She said it used to be a working class neighborhood. In fact, the guy next to me, my neighbor, he bought the first house in my neighborhood. My neighborhood is newer. It was built in the late 90s, early 2000s. And he paid, I think he said 295 for that house brand new. Well, his income, his lifestyle, right? He was a military guy. I paid a hell of a lot more than that a few months ago for that house. That's already happening, right? That shift is already happening. I even remember when I was a kid, it was like, oh, Dr. Jones, down the street, that's the rich guy on the block, right? I hadn't
Yeah.
thought about that point before, how, America used to be defined. We were kind of all on one note. And then there was the rich guy on the street. There was this family that had a bunch of kids, and they were always trying to make things happen and put food on the table, right? It was much more of a mixture. That class separation, now that you bring that up, is palpable today. I mean, it's pretty obvious in a lot of ways. My fear is that these prohibitive laws, these zoning policies, will make it even more impossible for the most underprivileged in our country, and kind of really even worse, and what makes me less hopeful is the middle class not being able to inch their way to a better life. That's the real fear with all this, is this doesn't just hold back one particular group anymore, as it sounds like it was intended to do. It holds back the entire country, really.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I mentioned this in the book, but 1926, the Supreme Court decides that this framework is constitutional. That's a decision called Euclid v. Ambler. But a lower court actually decided that it was initially ruled that it was unconstitutional. And what the judge said was, this is clearly an attempt to classify every American and then assign this American to a part of the city where they're allowed to live. And this judge, Judge Westenhaver, was like, this is obviously unconstitutional. This is obviously not what government is supposed to be doing. It was eventually rolled back by the Supreme Court. But in retrospect, that judge was absolutely correct. And to your point, I think this is partly what's changed over the last few years with this issue, is exactly that. It's now affecting everybody, right? So now you're in a situation where, maybe, lower income households, lower middle income households have always struggled with housing affordability to some extent. But your middle class family had no problem like affording a decent home in a decent neighborhood. But part of what I think has changed over the last 7 years in particular is now that middle or even upper middle income family is feeling the pressure. They might be finding that home prices in their community have spiraled beyond what they could conceivably afford, or they're stuck renting and they're spending 30 to 50% of their income on rent. So they can never even build up the wealth needed to make a down payment. Or they're finding that, okay, we can afford a home, but it's going to involve an hour-long commute into and out of the city, or maybe buying a home in an area that's facing certain environmental hazards, definitely in the years to come, right? And so this is affecting, I think, a broader cross-section of the population. And this is why I think it's burst onto the scene at the national level in every single state house. Is like when elected officials go out to their constituents and they're like, what are your quality of life concerns? Even though we fight about all these culture war issues, the average person, the number one line item in their budget is housing. And they're saying, I'm feeling the heat. I don't have a path to homeownership. My kids can't afford to live anywhere near me. The people who serve me at the hospital or the grocery store can't afford to live in our community anymore. And people are feeling it.
Right.
And so, the good news is I think there's a growing recognition of, okay, something's got to change.
Hey guys, if you want to watch the full episode of this clip, click right here. Make sure to subscribe by clicking right here. Thank you for watching.